so honored here to be introducing John Burrows, who is appearing before us. John, I hope you can see that in the room you are like the great and powerful Oz. And it feels really appropriate because those of you who are legal scholars in pretty much any field will know that John Burrows is a giant in the Canadian Legal Academy. He is a giant in my own chosen field of constitutional law, in terms of state and colonial constitutional law, as well as a giant in the field of Indigenous legal orders within Canadian legal scholarship. So it truly is an honor for us to host you here today, John. Thank you for joining us. So you've heard a number of land acknowledgements throughout the day, recognizing that we are gathered here today at the University of Toronto on the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And that this is the meeting place of many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. And this presentation gives us opportunity to really extend that acknowledgement and gratitude for all that we have received and continue to receive from Indigenous legal orders within the Canadian system. So we are hearing from John, who I believe is joining us from the historic and contemporary lands of the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and the Wasanic peoples. Is that where you're coming to us from today? Wonderful. And John is himself a member of the Chippewa of the NAALC First Nation. John Burrows was recently named the inaugural Loveland Chair in Indigenous Law here at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, and has also held the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Law at the University of Victoria. And we're going to hear from John today about some points of intersection between the field that we know of as animal law and the fields of Indigenous law. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the floor over to Professor Burrows. Take it away.
Miigwech. Bujun Ndinoe Maganidok, Niji Nishnabeg Nichmarzig, Bungie to go Ninata Nishnabem, Ingaguji Tunjishmayan, Giganos, Indigenous, Neashi Winigaming and Donjaba. So I'm introducing myself in a language of those territories there of Toronto, and Algonquian language, and Anishinaabe-Moin. And I'm really delighted to be with you and have this invitation to speak with you. I'm going to use a PowerPoint just to make points more explicit as I'm going through this presentation. I expect I'll talk for about 45 minutes, and then I hope we have an opportunity for questions and answers in the last part of our time here together. And it's also a delight to be the new chair in Indigenous law at the University of Victoria, University of Toronto. And I'm really grateful for this first occasion for me to be able to speak as chair in this setting. So as was perhaps advertised in the program, I'm going to be speaking to you today about animals in relationship to Indigenous law. And when I introduced myself a moment ago, I said I was Nigigan Dodem, which is I'm from the Otter clan. It's one of many clans of Anishinaabe people, and I can travel for 1,000 kilometers. And if I meet Otter people from Quebec to Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, those people would be my relatives, and I would also have responsibilities to them as they would have responsibilities to me from those clan teachings. And so Nigigan Dodem. I also mentioned Neashi Winigaming and Donjaba, which is I'm from the Portage Point or the Cape Croker Indian Reserve, the Chippewa of the NAALC, which is about 4 hours north of Toronto, about 5 hours north of Detroit on the Saugeen Ojibwe Peninsula. And you can see the Niagara Peninsula winds its way through our territories and through much of our lands as Anishinaabe people. And I'm grateful to call that home, where my mom and sister and generations have lived and continue to live now, a beautiful land of rocks and stones and wildlife. Today, I want to talk to you about this question from Wasanich territories, as well as Lekwungen-speaking peoples territories of the Esquimalt and Songhees, as was mentioned earlier. And my thesis is that Indigenous peoples' legal traditions teach that animals are an integral part of our political communities. My point is going to be that they are our first law professors, They brought us treaties, and we are related to them, as I mentioned a second ago, through clans and totems. We've often failed, though, unfortunately, to honor our legal inheritance from them. And so the work ahead involves revitalizing our legal traditions, and I'm going to say collectively, through restoring our relationship with animals and other life forces in our territories. And I'm going to make the point that Indigenous legal traditions should be considered a part of the landscape across Turtle Island or North America. And so the revitalization of Indigenous legal traditions is a part of restoring our relationship with animals across our territories. So I'm going to first talk a bit about my conceptual approach to this question, and then I will give you some examples, and those examples are about points of application, but I will end up in application both in a state context and in a more diffuse context, because part of what I want to argue with you is that law isn't something that just flows from a formal state structure, but it's also something that we do, not only as humans, but in the more than human world. So here's this point I'm trying to make, to think about law as a functional matter, a human activity, which is therefore directed to creating or identifying or deliberating together around standards, principles, processes, criteria, measures, indicia, benchmarks, precedents, guides, or intellectual and cultural resources, regulating our affairs, that is for making decisions and resolving our disputes. And if you think about law in this light, then you'll recognize that law, of course, doesn't just flow from formal institutions. All communities are involved in creating these ways of guiding our actions. So if I think about this in just another way here, law is present in the way that groups, including animals, solve problems, resolve conflicts, make collective decisions, create safety, maintain or repair relationships, and act on their relationships to each other. And so in this world, law is something that animals do, and it's something that other living beings do, including us as humans. And the challenge is to see ourselves in these relationships of solving problems and conflicts and decision-making and safety and responsibility for one another across the web of life. Our creation story as Anishinaabe people is set where Michilimackinac is. Mackinac is the word for turtle. Mishi is the word for great. Michilimackinac, or our word for Michi-Makinikong, is the place where after the flood, a turtle rose, and on the back of a turtle and in the water surrounding the turtle, animals counsel together about what to do to be able to bring up life from the depths of the water, to place it on the back of the turtle such that other life could continue and also be created on that space. And so on the back of the turtle, you have this muskrat, which is down there on the right-hand side, diving to the bottom of the waters, bringing up some morsels of soil and putting it on the back of the turtle, but losing his life in the process of doing so. And that decision of the muskrat to go down was a collective decision of many animals. Other animals tried and failed before the muskrat. The beaver tried and failed, and the otter tried and failed, and the loon tried and failed. But eventually you have this muskrat, the littlest of all of the creatures, succeeding when all of the other creatures wanted to dissuade muskrat from doing this. And so the creation was a process of animals counseling together with sky women, some say with our trickster Nana Bojo, in bringing the world together as we know it. And when these animals passed away, and they were giant animals, then the first Anishinaabe came out of their carcasses. We emerged out of their bodies as people. And so as the Otter clan, we are literally the descendants of the otter. And likewise, beaver and deer and eagle, the other beings that were found in that place. And so when we gather in council today as an Anishinaabe people, we are gathering as otters and eagles and bears, etc. And that is trying to continue to understand and learn from our older relatives, our teachers, our law professors, about how we should be acting as human beings and taking our guidance from them. There's a word in Anishinaabe for this, which is akinomagewin. Aki is the word for earth. Nomage is to point towards the earth and take direction from the earth. It's related to our word for teaching, kikinomage, which is to point to someone or something and take direction from that. And so in this realm, there's a legal methodology that has us look to the more than human world by way of analogy or distinction and learn the lessons from that behavior and try to map onto human behavior. So these relationships are often harmonious, as you can see here, and then sometimes they're fraught. Our learning of the necessity for law, again, came from the plants and the animals. One of our stories is that we used to have an abundance of elk and bison and deer and caribou and moose in our territory. And we would note that there were times of abundance and times of scarcity, and we would see that ebb and flow happen through millennia. But there was a time it was noticed that there were very few deer and moose and caribou and others in our territory. And the question became, where did they go? And so a council was called amongst the Anishinaabe to figure out the answer to this question. And no one had heard anything or had observations in our own territory as to where they might be. And so it was decided that we would send runners in different directions to see if other people knew about where they could be. So we sent runners to the east, to the Wabanaki. Waban is our word for dawn. Aki is our word for earth. So we went towards the dawn, visited the Abenaki people to the east, down the St. Lawrence River, and we visited with them. And they also reported that there was nothing to be found of the Hoof Nation. And so we came back to council and reported what we learned. And then someone was deputized to go into the southern direction amongst the Zhawani, the Shawnee people. Zhawan is our word for south in Anishinaabemowin. So we went amongst the Shawnee, south of the Lake Erie and Lake Ontario in the sort of Ohio Valley area, and came back after visiting with them and got that same message that none were to be found of the Hoof Nation. Concern, of course, was now quite strong, and so we sent people to the west to the Ningabianung, which is where the Venus planet, the star, falls into the waters. But we visited with our relatives, the Cree and the Dakota and the Potawatomi and the Odawa and the Meskwaki and the Fox and the Illinois and others there, and Kickapoo, and the message came back, nothing. No one had seen any members of this deer nation. And so then we went to the north, Giwedanong. Giwe is the go home direction. It's the northern star as well. It helps you to go home. And when we got there to the north, we noticed that there were all sorts of deer and moose and caribou and elk and buffalo, bison, etc. And we saw that they were amongst the crows. And we drew the conclusion that the crows must be keeping them against their will. They must be binding them in places in keeping them against how they would like to live their lives. And so what was then taking place is that the report came back to the council, and then the council spread this message through its members and then through the allied nations, and then a war party was launched to be able to go to liberate the deer and all of these hoof nations from the crows. And so we went north, and we went and had a long and bitter battle against the crows. And this battle would swing back and forth, one direction and another, with sometimes there being an appearance as if we were going to be victorious, and then sometimes the appearance as if the crow were to be victorious. And this was exhausting between the parties. Eventually, a truce was called, and at the truce, there was an invitation to meet with the chief of the deer. And so the Anishinaabe went and met with the chief of the deer, and the Anishinaabe leader said, what are you doing? We're fighting for your lives here, trying to rescue you from your forced confinement, and you're looking on with seeming indifference. We're spilling our blood for you, and you could seem to care less, just watching on the sidelines as if we were, nothing. And the deer, listening to what we said, took some time to compose itself, and then said, you are wrong. If you think that we are here against our will. And we, as Anishinaabe, wondered what that meant, and so asked for clarification, and said, well, you have desecrated our haunts, the place that we live. You've destroyed vast habitats, and we can't find food and place for our families in your midst anymore. And so the Anishinaabe were a bit taken aback by that, but saw some of the truth in what was being said. And the deer went on, and you've wasted our flesh. You've taken our flesh too frequently, and in doing so, you've not relied on the other parts of the world that are here. And in taking us, you've often just used very little and not taken us as a whole with that gift that we promised to give you when the world was set in motion. And so the Anishinaabe recognized those wasting habits that they had followed through. And then the deer also said, and you have desecrated our bones. When you have taken us, you have mistreated us in the way that you took our lives so that you might be able to live. And that is something that we no longer wanted to be a part of. And it was also the case that the deer said, and when you take us, you don't leave anything in return. There's no gifts that are coming back from you to ensure that you are also sacrificing in this relationship, and that it's creating a cost for you as well. And so the Anishinaabe, on hearing these points, were stricken and realized that they had not followed what they had been taught in those earlier councils with the animals. And so they entered into a treaty with the Hoof Nation and said, we will cease despoiling your places of residence, and we will cease wasting your flesh, and we will not desecrate you in the way that life is taken. We'll be very respectful if that has to occur. And likewise, we will put something back. We will leave things in return that will also cost us in this process. And in that exchange, in that treaty, the Anishinaabe and the deer and other nations agreed. And so they left the crows and they came back into our territory. There are many stories like this amongst Indigenous peoples, amongst Anishinaabe people as well. Sometimes it's the rabbit and the roses, and the roses were the species that were suffering because the animals were eating too many of the roses, and they weren't watching over one another in that way. And the humans weren't fulfilling their responsibilities in that regard either, because there was too many rabbits that were sort of gobbling up the rest of what was around. And so the point I'm making here is that not only did we learn our law from our origin stories, we also learn about the law of agreement and treaty through our relationships with the more than human world, in this case, with the Hoof Nation. Now, when settlers came to live amongst us, of course, we continued to have these laws. And part of what we wanted to do was have these laws be a continuing part of our land, a continuing part of our relationships with one another. And so here you see a picture of my great-great-grandfather and then a book of stories from my great-great-grandmother. And around my great-great-grandfather's neck, you can see a couple of treaty medals. And if you could read this book of my great-great-grandmother, you can get it in the library. You'll see many of these stories, like the one I just told you, about how to live well with the more than human earth. And so when people came amongst us to enter treaties with us, this wasn't just a Westphalian system of treaty making flowing from Europe. We had our own technologies of treaty making. We had our own standards, principles, criteria, measures, signposts, guideposts, traditions, precedents, intellectual and cultural resources for making decisions, regulating our affairs, and resolving our disputes. And we used those in the treaty process with those that came to be amongst us. So when my great-great-grandfather signed a treaty dealing with 1.5 million acres of land in Ontario, and if you know about Southern Ontario, that area of land would be from Goderich on the shores of Lake Huron to Arthur in the middle of the province, and then north to Collingwood, and then areas north of that. That's our treaty territory through a couple of generations. And when my great-grandfather signed that in 1850s, he put this little otter, Dotem, as you can see here in the middle, on the treaty. In other words, he wasn't just signing as a human being, he was signing as an otter. He was signing in remembrance of those creation stories. He was signing in remembrance of those legal stories about treaty that we have with the more than human world. And he was inviting settlers to live in accordance with this law, because a treaty is formed by two legal systems or two or more legal systems coming together. And so to interpret the treaty, it's not just what's on the face of the document in English in black and white print, it's the intention of the parties as they intermingle together that should form the meaning of the agreement. And so we say that of all people in Ontario are treaty people in our territory. That is, Anishinaabe people have treaties that we entered to with the Crown, but the Crown and those that settled under their laws also have treaty rights and obligations there. And then we've all settled under the laws that were there before us, which were those laws that flow from the winds and the waves and the rocks and the sun and the insects and the fish and the plants and the birds and the animals. And so the idea is, how do we bring this treaty tradition more fully to bear in our contemporary world? Now, when these traditions have not been followed and treaties have been ignored or pushed aside, particularly by governments, we continue to make our points as clans. Here's a petition from the 1850s from the Wisconsin area of Anishinaabe people speaking to the government in Washington. And you can see all their hearts are joined together. You can see those lines that connect them back and forth. And then you can see all their eyes are also joined together, and they're joined to the eyes of the crane and the heart of the crane, because the crane is the one whose voice echoes afar. And so the crane is the speaker for the group. And then the crane, that is the Anishinaabe leader of the Crane clan, delivers the message to Washington about how we need to live in these relationships of mutual care and reciprocity. You can see on the bottom there, the Red Lake Nation, which is in northern Minnesota. You can see some clan markers above their territory there. For official government functions too, they still have in addition to their elected leaders, they have clan leaders that would sit in council, that do sit in council and continue to try to bring these points forward. Now, remember, we have these relationships because Anishinaabe people messed up, right? As Indigenous peoples, of course, we have beauty in us, but we also have all of the challenges that other human communities have. We need to be careful not to romanticize Indigenous communities. We have our laws, sometimes because we did what was good and created a consensus around that, but sometimes we have our laws because we've made many mistakes and we've had to create decision-making criteria to deal with those mistakes. Again, we had to find standards, principles, authority, measures, indicia, benchmarks, yardsticks, precedents, traditions, regulations for helping us with our affairs. In a contemporary setting, you see here a much more drawn out set of ideas around Anishinaabe Chinaakanagewin governance, which is these treaties. There's 43 of them that are being talked about in Ontario. Some of them have been recently ratified. And then there's an overarching treaty amongst the Anishinaabe called the Chinaakanagewin, which is the Great Guided Way of Decision Making. That's our word for constitution in Anishinaabe-Moin. And you can see that we gather as clans to be able to make social and educational and external and internal and health related and economic dimensions with our life. And these are, again, ideas that will tell stories in relationship to these animals to figure out what these responsibilities are. It comes from observing the behavior of these animals over many generations. It comes from the wording, our own etymology for the deer, Wawashkeshi, or the eagle, Migize, or the turtle, Mikanak, or the loon, Mong, or whatever the case might be. This treaty system, which I've been talking about internally and that we shared with settlers that came amongst us, also found its life in wampum belts. Wampum is shells that are of different colors, and they're sewn into hides to make images. And in those images are relationships of people linking arms together, or traveling two rows, nation to nation, or sharing out of one dish, having one territory that sustains us, and not bringing anything sharp to that dish. So bringing a spoon, it's a dish with one spoon treaty that you see there in the center top of this screen, which was a treaty between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe. In other words, treaties weren't just between Indigenous peoples in the natural world, treaties were between Indigenous peoples. And then treaties were, of course, then with Indigenous peoples in the Crown. And you can see again how our technologies were used to make some of those earlier treaties with those that came amongst us. And at Niagara in 1764, 2,000 people gathered from 24 different Indigenous nations for over 2 months. And the relationship between the British and the Indigenous peoples of this area around Toronto and beyond was performed. We received these wampum from the Bear Nation, and we have a lot of stories about how we learned diplomacy from bears. And if I had time, I would tell you about how bears interact with humans to be able to learn more about what that wampum tradition, that treaty tradition was that we learned from those beings. Now, you also see this in a contemporary setting. Here's a buffalo treaty that is promulgated from 2014 onward. And in that Buffalo Treaty, you can see different First Nations in both Canada and the United States entering into a relationship with the buffalo and with one another to be able to, just like that Hoof Nation Treaty I talked to you about earlier, to sustain the buffalo and to sustain their habitats so that they can continue to live in their places. And as a part of that Buffalo Treaty, fortunately, Parks Canada agreed to put some buffalo into the back country of Banff National Park. And that was the first time those buffalo were wild there for over 100 years. And those buffalo are now making their way out of the park. And then there needs to be treaties with the municipalities and the provinces and the farmers and the others that are going into this area, because if those buffalo are shot on sight, we won't be able to fulfill our responsibility to these creatures. The idea is to have the free run of the buffalo again from Y to Y, from the Yukon to the Yellowstone. And there's treaties that are being like adhesions are being made to this treaty every year. So in 2022, there were further adhesions made by First Nations to this agreement. And you can go on the website and read more about this treaty, which is an example of other kinds of things that can be done. Of course, there's been just generations and millennia of these kinds of ways of living amongst the governing institutions of Indigenous peoples here. I'm speaking to you from the coast today of North America, and there's a potlatching tradition, a feasting tradition. And in those potlatches, you have narrations of how the world came into being. And you have the parties teaching, which are the trees and the thunderbirds and the bears and the eagles and the orca and others. And so, you know, through sort of 48 hours, you would have story after story after story about all of our more than human relations and what they've taught us about how to live well on the land and the waters. And then, of course, you also see people sitting here at the front who have button blankets that would be their clan, if they're, you know, orca or thunderbird or, you know, whatever the case might be. And they would be the hosts of this gathering. And in that gathering, they would create responsibilities, actually recreate responsibilities for land and water and family and commercial exchanges and constitutional matters. And at the end of this event, there would be a huge feast giveaway where the chiefs would have to give away their material possessions to create, again, this relationship of reciprocity with the humans that were gathered there, but with the other clans that are gathered there. So with the other orcas or bears or cedar trees or fireweed or whatever was gathered in that site. That was outlawed by the Canadian government from the 1880s till the 1950s, and it's now in resurgence. There are modern contemporary environmental assessment processes, and you see here an example from the Skeetchison Secwepemc people coming together, you know, the water world, sky world, flora, fauna, fisheries, with their elders, youth, family, council, etc., in a counseling process. Again, this is the interior of British Columbia. But I've discovered about 50 of these kinds of approaches that are being taken by Indigenous peoples across Canada, where they're joining these assessment processes with their teachings in relationship to the more than human world. Some people have negotiated modern day treaties with the federal and provincial governments, as the Niska people. They have a Westminster form of parliamentary type government, but they've modified that by their House system and their Ayuk system, their WILP system, which again has animals involved in that. And so those animals come into that system in a living way in that fashion. You can have legislation passed by the Canadian government. Here's the Westbank First Nations heads of power for self-government. But you might be interested to know that this is all presided over by 4 food chiefs. And those chiefs are black bear, spring salmon, bitterroot, and Saskatoon berry. And in speaking with and through and about and by and of these chiefs, the idea is that they're not just being human-centric. They're supposed to be thinking about what are the whole needs of the territory around our sustainability. This is working its way into child and family services. Here's an example from the Peguis First Nation. In the corner, you can see those values of law there that are attached with animals. The Peguis First Nation has created law that you can read for their children that's been enabled by Bill C-92, which is an act of the federal parliament to allow this kind of law to come forward. Also, there's questions of stewardship over land, which often flow from Aboriginal title. This idea our elders and ancestors have passed the responsibility to protect our lands and ways of life to us. It's not possible for us to agree to the destruction of the land that sustains us. And if you think about the elders and the ancestors also being the animals, then you get a broader view of what's being talked about here with Aboriginal title. So our framework in Canada for this, and I've got about 5 more minutes to go, is reconciliation, bridging legal systems, creating intersocietal law, where Canadian constitutional law reconciles both Indigenous law and federal and provincial law. You can see that through treaty, but now we also have a constitutional regime through case law that says a morally and politically defensible conception of Aboriginal rights would incorporate both the Indigenous legal perspective as well as the Crown's legal perspective. And so this idea of reconciliation is a reconciliation of laws. It's a reconciliation of legal traditions. In other words, if we think back to my earlier slides there, we cannot be reconciled with one another until we're also reconciled with the more than human world. Reconciling ourselves with the more than human world is one of the ways that humans are going to come to reconciliation with one another, because that will give us a common project. It will give us something to do together. Even though we'll disagree about how we do that together, there'll be, as we learned in our initial creation councils or our treaties with the Hoof Nation and others, that kind of focus is what's needed. This is also, as I mentioned, part of our case law tradition. Vanderpeet says that traditional laws and customs are those things passed down and arising from the pre-existing culture and customs of Aboriginal peoples. Those are to be reconciled with the existence of the assertion of sovereignty by the Crown in these settings. So Delgamuukw said that the Aboriginal perspective on occupation of our lands, their lands, should be gleaned in part from their traditional laws. And those, again, laws are about animals and plants and winds and waters. Or here in the Mitchell case, Aboriginal interests and customary laws were presumed to have survived the assertion of sovereignty. They weren't extinguished by the arrival of English or French laws. The court has said time and time again. So these laws then are part of Canadian law. They're part of Canada's highest law. They're part of our Constitution. And I'm now wanting to, again, just remember that constitutions are something that people do. And so I'm going to read this quote here from a paper I'm writing. And then I just have one more slide, I think, which is to say, we must learn politics and law from our ancestors. Plants, insects, birds, and animals have much to teach us. We are their descendants and they are our elders. We would not exist without them. They came first and they continue to sustain us. Our evolutionary lineage and our biophysical dependence points to this fact. We sever ourselves from what sustains us if we separate politics or law from the air, water, rocks, plants, insects, birds, animals, and other such kin. Our political lives depend on respectfully nurturing that which nurtures us, which includes our natural environments. And the living world provides the very conditions from which all other activities flow. Again, we cannot be reconciled with others unless we first reconcile ourselves with the living earth. Therefore, I'm saying that democracies must look backwards to life's sources to narrate any political forward. Human words do not precede us. They arrived much later than the winds, waves, pulses, vibrations, drones, barks, whines, growls, calls, and songs of our first teachers. Human politics, including democratic politics, is not the precondition to healthy living. Something primordial, something beyond words precedes us. So let me suggest, as I've been trying to do, that we learn the lessons through the water and the winds. We listen to the natural world, which requires a literacy that's hard to convey through language. If we see the earth as an archive that we must learn to read, then we need to read it scientifically, socially, culturally, legally, spiritually, and politically. Our own language connects us to the earth in that way. I think I've made my point with what is here on this slide. We need to learn from those that are very different from us, but also us. We are related to them, right? Just like human beings are very different from one another, we're similar to one another. Animals are very different and similar to us. Thank you for your patience too. We did have a power outage here for 15 minutes and I have no idea what occurred, but we're back together and I'm glad of that. So I was just concluding by ending where I started, which is to say law is a human activity, but it's an animal activity. It's a more than human activity. And if we think about law functionally, Then, of course, there's things that institutions like legislatures and courts can do. But there's also things that communities can do, and hospitals and universities and families and other organizations to really identify standards, principles, authority, criteria, measures, guideposts, signposts to help regulate our affairs and resolve our disputes. And if law is something we do, it's a verb, then there's an opportunity for this to be picked up across the spectrum. And maybe that's one of the lessons of Indigenous law, which is, of course, legislatures and courts are important, but they're not necessary for law. Law has a life beyond that institutional setting. Many legal traditions in different times and spaces have functioned without the kinds of order that we've placed ourselves within here in North America. And this is a call to see law in its multifaceted dimensions. And so if we are going to keep learning from the animals about what our legal responsibilities are, and we see the Congress or the gathering of wisdom being out there beyond ourselves, as well as then something that we can take into our human communities, that is hopefully some space to work on this question, even if legislatures don't cooperate or courts don't get to the position that we want them to get to tomorrow. In the meantime, we can keep building all of these other networks of legal action. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Burrows. So I have a couple of questions, but my heart goes out to the audience who I know will have questions as well, and I don't want to take up their time with my own questions. So I am going to start off with one question for you, but I'm also going to invite those who would like to add their own questions to come line up in either of the aisles if you're able, or raise your hand if you would prefer a microphone brought to you. And that way we'll be all ready to take your questions after I seize the moderator's prerogative to ask Professor Burrows a question first. So I think your presentation has called on us to reflect on the role of listening to our more than human kin as we try to develop our legal orders and understand our responsibilities and relationships. But a lot of the animals referenced in your stories, the stories that you shared with us today, were animals that colonial legal ontologies would classify as wildlife, right? We were talking about otters, butterflies, frogs, animals that are in a habitat that is actually in part informing the relationships that they're able to tell us about. Many of us in this room as animal lawyers are really preoccupied with the circumstances of animals who are in circumstances of extreme confinement. So broadening this to the more than human world more broadly, we might think about monoculture crops, but in the context of animals, we might think about animals in factory farm settings or CAFOs. And I was wondering if you had thoughts that you could share on how this process of listening to the more than human world might differ, if at all, when we're dealing with animals who are in circumstances of extreme confinement like this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So, I think it's possible to listen for sounds of pain and agony and trauma, and to be able to communicate what we're hearing through the way they respond to their confinement, the way they respond to how they're being treated. And, people have done work on this. I think of my colleague Manisha here at University of Victoria, DECA, who's done incredible work in trying to draw out some of the extreme challenges that those kin are facing. And so, that work can just continue. And we listen to the beauty when the beauty is there with the loon's call, and we listen to the cry, and we respond to the cry as well as the beauty. The other thing to say about that is I grew up around those kinds of animals. I lived on a farm. It was we had horses and chickens and cows and small numbers, a few pigs. And I remember my generations before, 2 or 3 generations before, did the same thing. And one of the stories that is really big in my family is how when this beloved horse of my grandfather passed away, he just broke down and cried. And it was as if he had lost, it was like he had lost a family member. And, this is a person of stoic demeanor with lots of sort of toughness in the world because of all that colonialism had presented to him, but he also had that side of relationship with animals. So he knew the horse in that friend type way. And I also have had that experience with horses as well as birds and others that in other spaces are confined and tortured and not enabled to live free. And you get to know the different personalities of that. Now, I know someone in downtown New York City or Toronto or Vancouver is not going to have that opportunity, but that's where we read, right? We learn from one another through reading. We learn about what others are saying as they're reflecting what the animals are telling us. And so there's still access to that, although I, of course, would prefer that we could have those closer personal relationships, but there, it's kind of 3 layers that I presented there in thinking through the answer to that question. And I'm sure there'd be many more.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Burrows. So I'd like to invite Kristen still up to the microphone. I think this is the way that we can be heard by Professor Burrows. Yes.
Yeah, if you could speak into the computer.
If that's all right with you. Yeah, please line up if you're willing to come and ask your question at the podium, but if you'd like the microphone brought to you, raise your hand and we'll take care of that.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for this. I've been looking forward to this for many, many weeks. And the story of the deer and the crow really struck me, and for a couple of reasons. And I wanted just to ask you, I'll tell you what those are. Then I want to ask really, what role does that story play in contemporary life? Like, what meaning has that had going forward? Because the complaints of the deer were not you kill us, you use us, but you waste us. So it wasn't a respect our life. It was respect us when you kill us. The killing should at least use all of us. And that I was curious as to whether or not there's any human reflection on that narrative, insofar, and this relates to what Jess just said, that the relationship with animals whom we might eat or utilize is probably not often like that anymore in most parts of our countries. And does it give license to use and consume animals in ways that are different? That is, from factory farms, from mass production and such. So I guess I'm really asking, what work does that story do, either on permitting the killing and eating, or on reining in the types of meat that can be consumed?
Thank you. So a few things to say, and that's a great question. First of all, and I know you'll all know this, whenever you learn a case, you have to think about how that case relates to other cases. And so this story is like a case, and then you have to think about how this story or this case relates to other cases. In other words, beware the danger of a single story. You're always learning law in context. You wouldn't learn about contract law just through Hadley and Baxendale alone. You'd have to have the whole thing in motion with one another. But having made that just qualification, this story still does have a lot to teach us about our contemporary settings. If you think about factory farms, and if you think about the way that animals are being tortured and killed, there's a violation of that relationship with the hoof nation, right? Because those cows could be easily considered part of that nation. And so there's that dimension. There's also, I think, a reflection there that is a challenging one for all of us, which is we all live on the flesh of others, whether it be the flesh of the grass and the mushroom and the plant, or we live on the flesh of those workers that are producing the rice and the grain, and they're not being very well compensated for that. They're literally putting their flesh into that labor, which then we abstract in our own economic systems with the monoculture around the factory farming of these other species. So in other words, the idea here is to think about the notion of monoculture and having to rely on one another's flesh to survive, but to try to do that as respectfully as possible, in line with the standards, principles, criteria that are found in that and other stories. And that calls, I think, on us to stop what we're doing with those farms. And even when we're thinking about plants and the way that we interact with plants, to stop the monoculture of the earth, because that's kind of one of the lessons of this story, which is the need for diversity, the need for the configuration of meeting across different points of possibility. And if we have factory farms, it looks like there's a lot of animals, but that can lead to scarcity. It can lead to scarcity because they take up energy from the biosphere and from the food system that could be devoted to other animals and plants, or they themselves have a disease that goes through them and wastes them in their own lives, but also then prevents those that are relying upon them for food for also having a future with them. It's just not treaty. It's just not legal. It's just not healthy to have those kinds of systems be so focused on that mode of production. And I think that's part of the story.
Thank you so much. I think a phrase that I'm going to take with me today, Professor Burrows, is the danger of a single story. I think that's a really important framing for us to all have in mind here. So seeing no one in the aisles, I'm going to again, we've got some raised hands. Okay, can the whole, oh, you're going to come on up here. Okay.
I just thank you so much for that beautiful presentation. It was really, I learned a lot and I really appreciated it. I'm thinking forward, and I'm thinking as an animal activist, part-time animal activist. It seems like it's very clear that Indigenous people should be really some of our animals' strongest allies, based on everything that you've shared with us. And I'm just kind of curious on a practical level. What what is the path forward to tapping into that potential allyship and sort of building those relationships and sort of all sort of moving forward towards sort of better animal protection together with Indigenous people? What would be the most effective way to do that, in your opinion?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I would say, first of all, to do it in line with the principles I've talked about, which is the friendship, the peace, the respect, the treaty principles that are found there, love and honesty and etc. That would be one way of living into this. Secondly, to recognize that a lot of relationships with Indigenous peoples at a certain time in the past have been extractive and have been for other purposes that aren't holistic. And so I would just caution that if those allyships are developed, that they really are reciprocal, like in that treaty that I mentioned earlier, rather than what principles or ideas can we cherry pick from here and sort of cut and paste and put over into another system, and in doing that lose the nuance that's associated with these ideas. And so that's a second point. And then a third point would be to pick up the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's 94 of them. They're directed to different walks of life, different institutions and people. You'll find many good recommendations that can be analogized or generalized to this community of animal activists. I don't think that community is addressed in the TRC, but you could certainly see what's directed to the law societies or the museums or the post-secondary educational institutions or the criminal justice system and say, hey, that could be something we could do as a group of activists in relationship to animals, and ensure that when we're developing relations, it's considered in the way that the TRC process helped us be more mindful of relationships that move beyond depression.
Thank you so much for that. We've got another question coming up down the aisle.
So my question related to the call that you launched to use the connection to animals to reconcile Indigenous laws and people with federal Canadian laws and people. So I remember having read a book a couple of years ago about Greenland, and regarding the dependence of Greenland's economics on seal hunting. And at the time, I was fascinated by the finding that, in fact, the fact that seal hunting had become a monoculture in Greenland had been imposed by the Danish colonizers. So before that, Indigenous people in Greenland did practice seal hunting, but it was not a monoculture. They did have lots of different activities. And it was the Danish crown that imposed seal hunting as a monoculture. And then the EU came up and declared in 1989, I don't remember exactly, but I think it's 1989. So as of now, people in Greenland should avoid practice seal hunting because it's contrary to our conservation laws. And they can do it, but not for commercial purposes, only like for traditional reasons and for their very basic livelihoods. So based on this case of Greenland, I was wondering whether you would say that the interactions between Indigenous people in Canada with the Canadian Crown has transformed the way Indigenous people were relating to animals, or all animals or some of them, and also what you thought of Canadian conservation policies and how they affect the rights of Indigenous peoples in terms of harvesting, hunting, and engaging in economic activities.
Yes, thank you for that question. So I've taught in Nunavut. We had a law school in the north through the University of Victoria where Inuit students were taught in their own communities with elders, along with law professors coming from the south. And David Schneiderman from U of T was one of my colleagues that came and had that experience together. And what we learned from those folks is, yes, the imposition of European and Western values in relationship to their animal relationships has been very harmful. One you've mentioned a second ago. And it's something that they're trying to reestablish balance with. I remember being in that site and paying, I think it was $13 for 4 apples, and $10 for a head of lettuce, and and of course you could get canned food, but it was also very expensive. So in order to literally survive there, there was a need to go out to the ice floes and follow the caribou herds, because you just couldn't live on store-bought food. Food sovereignty was related to the country and the having the healthy relationship like you're describing. And part of reestablishing that, I have a friend, Madeline Redfern, who's one of my students, who's recently written an article in a book that we published at Cambridge University Press on international trade and Indigenous peoples, who makes a call for a more balanced relationship with caribou and seal and the European Union and Greenland in particular around some of the recent litigation there with tariffs, etc. On the other piece, I'm encouraged by something which is the development of the Indigenous protected and conservation areas. You see that happening from coast to coast to coast now, and federal and provincial governments are acting in relationship with Indigenous peoples to set aside land for the purposes of conservation. And in British Columbia and in other provinces too, there's something called guardians, who are Indigenous peoples using their own laws to create a relationship of stewardship and enforcement in those territories. And they're kind of cross-deputized. Those guardians can use provincial law if need be to help with the health and animal population there, but they also use their own laws, and they use their own laws in multi-faceted ways, in sort of regulation, but also in prevention by telling stories and taking people out into those spaces. There's something called the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Council, where you can read about some of this work as well. So there are positive things, even as on the other side, people continue to regard animals as individuals, and there's this sense that they're not in communities. And so often the prosecution is, if you kill an animal out of season, of course, there should be prosecution for that. But there should be a broader sense of what is going on with those people as you interact with, Indigenous people. And I would just like to see those laws reformulated to be more in line with the Indigenous protected and conserved areas and the guardian roles that are being developed across the nation, across the continent, actually.
Thank you so much. So our next question is from Manisha Deka, who needs no introduction for you or anyone in the room.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jess. Thank you so much, John. Nice to see you. This one? Okay, great. Okay, of course, I could have just walked down 3 doors to ask you this in your office about 2 days before coming here. But I will ask you now just, so we all have the collective benefit of your thoughts. So it's a question about the role of universities and particularly law schools in kind of creating these synergies between kind of taking what I think is fair to say is, kind of normative discourse now in many Canadian universities, as well, certainly at law schools, about indigenization and reconciliation and decolonization. And kind of the disconnect there to kind of not thinking about more than humans in any kind of institutional sense, or perhaps, getting kind of the law students in a more collective sense beyond kind of individual courses or individual research papers to make these connections. And then I particularly wonder, even on something like campus catering policies, for example, or thinking about, animals in the research labs at public universities. We have universities like the University of Victoria and others as well, talking about indigenization being such a core value, yet there is no kind of critique of these normative mainstream type of Canadian uses, whether it's, using the animals in the farmed animals or the lab animals. So, I myself would really love to see more of an engagement thinking about these mainstream Canadian uses in industries through the lens of indigenization. And do you think, or have you ever been in conversation with anyone at an institutional normative level about, maybe these are just conversations for obvious reasons that I haven't been privy to, but, what is the hope and the scope for universities to lead in terms of social change, and really for law faculties to lead, given now, as your presentation, so well laid out for us, the recognition, even within Canadian law, of Indigenous legal orders and hopefully, the multi-species aspects of those. Thank you.
Yes, no, thank you, Misha. I love the question, and I agree with the premise of it, which is Indigenous law should be informing what universities are doing in making decisions about research in relationship to animals, because part of the law of that territory won't just be federal or provincial law. It would also be, say, in the University of Victoria context, in Chothan law. And so having elders from the Wasanich communities and the Kwungan and the Esquimalt communities talk to these researchers and present what their standards, principles, criteria, measures, guideposts, signposts are in relating to animals, I think you would find that some of the ways that maybe many of the ways that those animals are being treated is contrary to the law of this land. And that could be replicated in Cree territories at the University of Saskatchewan, or Mi'kmaq territories at Dalhousie University. In other words, wherever you go, there are Indigenous peoples that will have laws in relationship to animals. And we've had a hard time influencing STEM fields, science and technology and engineering and medicine, in terms of these questions. Maybe our humanities and social sciences and law faculties can bring the kinds of ideas that I'm talking about to our colleagues in STEM and have some kind of process of engaging them, such that there could be a willingness to see that when they have their responsibilities in the university, they can't just be acting by those legislative or judicial criteria. They also have to be acting in relationship to the laws that are there from that territory as well. And so I really appreciate that question, because I think it allows me to reinforce and stress the idea of law as an activity that takes place in universities. And it's not just from the governing council of the university. It's something that could be activated in faculties as well. And there could be a reaching out to those communities in the kind of allianceship that we talked about earlier, that wasn't extractive and had some reciprocity and wasn't just tokenizing and using the local Indigenous peoples. You'd have to listen to them as well and hear what might have to occur in that development of a relationship. But I have been involved with that just very slightly, not with animals, but with wild rice at the University of Minnesota. And there was some really good development that took place when elders and communities worked together with scientists to change the way that they were working with that species. And it was helpful for the species as well as for the humans working in relationship to that beautiful plant.
Thank you so much. So we have only 2 minutes left on the clock, and yet I want to pivot to ask you a question that definitely requires more than 2 minutes to answer. This morning, we spent a lot of time talking about animals' legal status as property in the Canadian state legal order. And I know that you and other work have talked about the diverse approaches to property across Indigenous legal orders and the distinction between some of those approaches and property in the Canadian state legal order. And often your conversations have been focused on what we might think of as real property or immovable property. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity in closing to share some reflections, resources, things we ought to keep in mind as we reflect on propertization of nature and animals as a challenge for people working within animal law, and what some of the Indigenous legal orders you described might have to offer in terms of resources that we can have in mind. I just want us, as we walk away from the day with that, thinking about property law, I would love us to have your voice in our heads as well.
So, we have a joint degree here at the University of Victoria Law School, an Indigenous law degree and a common law degree. Over 4 years, students can get a JID, Juris Indigenous Doctorate, and a JD, Juris Doctorate. And then these courses are learned trans-systemically and then in the field out in communities. And we have a property law course taught by Val Napoleon and sometimes by Jeremy Weber that puts Gitsan law aside common law property. And one of the lessons there, again, is the diversity of these forms. When I think about property from an Anishinaabe legal concept, the word is Debane-Jagade. And that means something different than property in a Western legal setting. And our word for freedom is debain nindizo. And so the word for property and freedom are really closely related to each other. And it means the freedom to own the responsibility for your relationships. That's the word for property and freedom. Citizenship is also a very closely related word to these issues. And so what I'm saying here, just as a methodological point, is maybe if you look at other conceptions of property from other philosophical, legal, linguistic systems, property can be reframed away from some of its Western notions, and we can think about it as there's a responsibility that's attached to it, that you're owning your responsibility for those relationships that you're working. I've written a whole book called Freedom and Indigenous Constitutionalism, which develops this idea of freedom and property in that light. And it's just, again, a small slice into what you could do with many legal traditions and say, well, why are we just taking the common law property definition of this? There's so many other ways to conceive of our relationships with those things that we also need to survive.
Thank you so much. I can't think of a more provocative and thoughtful place for us to end this conversation. I think that's given me a lot to think about in terms of our conversations about property earlier today and everything that you've shared with us this afternoon. So thank you so much, Professor John Burrows.
Thank you, everyone, and take care.
Okay. Thanks, John.